And thank you all for coming. So my talk today is based on a paper from Psychophysiology last year that I wrote with two colleagues, Andrea Kübler and Jing Jin. And the title of the paper, as well as my talk, is 30 plus years of P300 BCIs. And my academic affiliation is with the Cognitive Science Department at UC San Diego. And you may know that Kai also went to UCSD. Indeed, that's where we met. And perhaps someday you will have the great fortune of going to one of our favorite places out there called Pizza Port. But I'll have to move on to something formal now, or I'll get all whimsical. So I just have the usual disclaimers to start with. This is just my perspective. I'm not representing anyone else. Nobody paid me for this talk. I'm just doing it for the love of science and, of course, the love of Kai. This is an online talk. And I thought I'd start with two slides with basics of BCIs. And I'll go pretty quickly through them since I know that you're experienced with that. But the canonical definition comes from this paper, Walpaugh et al. 2002. And this is the most heavily cited paper in our field. It's been cited more than twice as much as any other BCI-related publication. And the bottom left and the left side overall show that you have the first component, which is signal acquisition. You have to get the signal from the brain. This might be from signals recorded outside the head, such as MEG or fMRI or something on the surface of the head, or you might have something inside the head. Then you have signal processing, which basically means you have all these squiggly lines on paper. You have to translate them to something, into device commands. Then the bottom right indicates that you have commands that you can send to an outside device. It might be a monitor or a wheelchair. And then, although it's not shown in this figure, the fourth component is an operating system, something that governs how these other three components interact with each other and work with the user. And this picture here is the second author of the paper, Dennis McFarlane, and he was also my boss and Gerb's boss when we worked in the Walpaugh lab a long time ago. And I'm very sorry to say that he passed away last year, but I'm sure he'll be remembered in the field for his work. He has a lot of great papers, and you should check them out. So Dr. Walpaugh and his wife, who's also Dr. Walpaugh, updated this approach about 10 years later in 2012. And you see that they have the same four components. First, you have signal acquisition. Second, you have signal translation. Third is you have an output. And fourth, you have some sort of operating approach. But they refined this approach so that they also grouped BCIs according to the application. So a BCI could be used to replace a lost function. It could be used to restore a function that had been lost, but you want to recover. That's such as stroke recovery. And then the bottom three are generally more speculative. The enhance approach, often you see that with passive BCIs. That one's not so speculative, but the other two are. So the idea that you would have a BCI supplement existing control, that is, you might be using both of your hands, and then the BCI gives you a third hand. There's not a lot of that right now, mainly because the mental attention required to use a BCI is such that the third hand wouldn't be that beneficial. It would get in the way. Of course, if you could do this, you'd see a lot of applications for gaming and other domains. And then the improve approach on the very bottom is kind of like the restore approach, but the idea is that you are improving mental activity beyond human norms, that you're not so much restoring a lost function as improving function to levels that most people currently don't have. And so those two are more speculative. I can't think of a lot of examples of those. So the next few slides, I'll switch over to P300 BCI basics. And this is a slide I like to include because it has the word nerve spelled in German and then everything else is in English. So of course, I just have this there to make fun of the German language, which Gerb told you earlier I very much enjoy. I'm much better at making fun of it than I am at speaking it. unlike curve. The first P300 BCI was published in 1988 by Farwell and Donchin. And in this approach, there is a certain target stimulus, which might be a letter. In this case, it's just a red dot. And by choosing to pay attention to each time that target stimulus flashes, the user can elicit a P300 to that target stimulus and not to other stimuli. And this is a key element of what makes it a communication system. You can simply choose to count each time that red dot flashes or ignore it. And if you choose to count it, you're going to see a fairly big wave called the P300. And if you choose to ignore it, you won't see the P300. And with this particular example, of course, one flashing dot is not that useful, can be useful, but you'd rather have something more advanced like spelling. And so here's a fun way that we can play a simple game that's like using a P300 BCI. So you see here that there is a matrix, a 6x6 matrix with letters and numbers. And so the short game is to count the number of times that the letter P flashes. So I'm going to start it and just count to yourself whenever you see the P flash. See, that was one. And it'll continue, and I can speak over it. Pretty soon you'll have the second one. Anyway, I'll stop it. But the point is that by choosing to pay attention to one specific event out of a series of events, you would have produced a P300 in response to every time the P flashed and not any other letter flashing. And you could have done this with any target letter. It could have been the R or the D or a number or something like that. And so all the computer has to do is identify which flash produced a P300, and you can thereby infer the letter to which the user attended. And most systems are not using this single stimulus approach like this. So usually they're grouped into rows and columns. And so you're instead counting rows and columns, and you're looking for the intersection of that target row and column. And that's how you manage to identify the target letter. So this approach, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just slower. I just did this for the purposes of a quick demonstration.
And the reason, Brandon, of course, why it's the P shall forever be a mystery.
Well, it's P, no, it's only not forever, but until I explain it as I should have. The reason that it's P is because it's a positive deflection in the EEG. And the reason it's 300 is that it tends to develop about 300 milliseconds after the target stimulus.
I meant the character P.
Oh, the character P is just because of P300. Another much more juvenile layer is to point out the color of the circle, but mainly I was doing it for purely erudite reasons. So, seminal studies. So P300 BCIs have been around since 1988, but P300s have been around longer than that. And there are two studies that are credited with starting P300s, and here they are. They were published in 1964 and 1965, and these were pretty early studies in terms of the entire event-related potential literature. So people found the P300 pretty early on, and at the time they were not looking for a communication system. They were trying to identify BCIs or EEG components that relate to attention. So as I've said, the P300 is largely reflective of attention, what you choose to pay attention to. And therefore, these guys just found that if you're paying attention to something, you get a P300 that's larger than if you don't. And also that it relates to things like uncertainty and other factors. But for the purposes of BCIs, we're only looking at selective attention. This was the first study in 1988 from Farwell and Donchin. This here is a picture of Emmanuel Donchin. And this has been called the Donchin matrix in the literature. And the reason that I put this up is that once I was giving a lecture about this, and I referred to it as the Donchin matrix, and Professor Donchin came up to me after that and asked me not to use that term because he felt that it was pompous. He did not think he should have the matrix named after himself. And so I told him that in any subsequent talks, I would just say that it's not a Donchin matrix, subsequent talks about his work. And so I am. But Professor Donchin had a lot of good papers about P300s long before this one. And you see the display here is also a 6x6 display. This is a commonly used approach, although there are quite a lot of other ones. And these are a few other ways that you can implement the flashing approach. So parts A and B show that you can have row and column flashes. In this case, the example shows a column flash. And what B shows is that instead of having the letters flash by changing color, such as changing to white, you can instead have them flash by turning into faces. And the reason that you have faces is that faces will first elicit a larger P300, and second, may elicit other components of the event-related potential, such as the N4. And so basically, by using faces, you can have a more effective P300 BCI. If you have more distinct differences between the target and the non-target, then you can improve classification and thereby information throughput. And part C and D show a couple other examples. In part C, there was one study that explored changes in facial expression rather than just presenting a face. And then part D shows that you can also group stimuli more randomly across the screen. Instead of being in columns and rows, you can have a sort of splotch-like approach. And that is a slight benefit over the row-column approach because it reduces something called flanker effects that can reduce P300s. And so nowadays you see a lot of P300 BCIs that use this approach in part D. And for more seminal studies, another big deal was extending the P300 BCI beyond the visual domain. So there have been P300 BCIs that used auditory stimuli and tactile stimuli. And in theory, they're possible with other sensory modalities. For example, I've seen olfactory ERPs. You could get gustatory ERPs. There was even a paper by Andrea Kübler and colleagues that explored P300s to imagined visual stimuli. And of course, I don't think that olfactory and gustatory BCIs would be as practical, at least with the goal of helping patients, but they're possible. And in particular, and I put this in blue because it's relevant to several slides, with auditory and tactile approaches, you can try to help persons with a disorder of consciousness. And I'll get to that later in the talk. Also, there have been some great papers with home use. So this is one of our friends named Teresa Vaughn, and she is probably the kindest person in the entire BCI field. There are many, many people in the field with a big heart, but Teresa is just remarkable. And she's devoted much of her career toward making BCIs practical for long-term home use and also independent home use. And this has long been a problem in the field and still is a problem today, that it's one thing to get a BCI working in the lab, but if you want to get a BCI that works at home, that's something of a challenge. But in particular, you want something that works at home independently in the long term. That is, you want something where you can give a system to a patient and that patient, with help from family or a caretaker, is able to use the system for ideally years, for as long as they want, without getting help over and over again. So it used to be the case that first it was the case that nobody had a BCI at home at all. And then the very few people who ever got access to a BCI were people who only got to use a BCI while a nearby grad student or postdoc was there, because you needed an expert to, in our case, take a suitcase with an amplifier down to a patient's home in New York City. So for example, Gurv and I had to get on a train and take a system to this person's home, and put the cap on his head and then take the system back and analyze the data. And what about the rest of the time? What if that person had wanted the BCI while we weren't there, which is the overwhelming majority of the time? And that's still a challenge. Like I said, Teresa Vaughan has done a lot to do this, but that was certainly a seminal advance in the field. Not so much a single one, but the attention to getting a system that patients can use at home on demand. So there's one short story. I'll have a brief digression here, taking advantage of our audience, that once there was an example where someone had a system for home use and it just stopped working and nobody knew why. And so they called GERV and nobody could immediately find out why. The system just wasn't displaying anything. And what GERV eventually found out is that someone had accidentally sent a sequence of commands, or I think it was control page up or something like that, but GERV would remember. And that gave the system the instruction to transfer the display to another monitor, but there was no second monitor, and so the system was blank. So imagine this from the perspective of a patient who needs to communicate. I mean, that's an obvious flaw in the system. And this is back in the early days when, again, getting a system to work at all was impressive, let alone at someone's home. But this is one example of why it takes a lot of work to make a system that works at home. So I would guess that GERV adjusted the system so you could no longer send that command. But back then, that kind of thing was a big obstacle to long-term independent home use. And these are a few other examples of big studies in the field. So hybrid BCIs have been a big deal, not just with P300 BCIs, but with all BCIs, which basically means that you are combining one type of BCI with another BCI. You can also use BCIs for device control. So I have a few slides showing that, where you can have BCIs that can control external devices. The middle image doesn't actually show control of a device, it's just a monitor. But the monitor shows that you can direct a mobile robot in different directions. And the bottom two corner icons are to grasp and give something. And this has been a big issue in the literature, again, with many BCIs, and not just P300 BCIs, that if you're controlling a robot or a wheelchair or something, you generally don't want the system to only provide low-level commands, such as move forward, move sideways. You ideally want the system to also provide some high-level commands, such as grasping or giving, or performing a sequence of actions, because you would like to be able to free the patient from these burdens. So how do our bodies work? I mean, in general, you're following action sequences. You're doing a long series of very complex movements rather than individual, maybe ballistic movements that by themselves don't do any good. And so the grasp and give commands would instruct the robot. It's not just grabbing, but would say, go to this location and grab something. And then the give command would be to come back and give. So in this case, we were working with water bottles. So someone could direct a robot to go somewhere and grab a water bottle, or to come back and give the water bottle. And then we also included the arrows to provide low-level control, because otherwise the patient was limited to just two functions. And only the middle one, by the way, is work that I did. So the two on either side are work from different groups. And so they're cited here. The middle one, Spatato, the first author was a neurologist and neurosurgeon named Rosella Spatato. And I'll talk about her more when I get to the disorder of consciousness work. But before then, I have a few slides about something called brain painting. And there are a few groups that do this. I'm presenting an approach that is also called brain painting from the second author, Andrea Kübler, who has been a big force within P300 BCIs for many years. And in panel A, I show an example of a spelling matrix in the German language. So you may say, wow, that's a truly gruesome and horrific language. Look, they have the and the and the E down there on the bottom row. And yet, believe it or not, tens of millions of people around the world speak using this language. And if you ever hear Gerwin Shaw talking to the aforementioned Dr. Guger, you will hear them speaking very quickly, and they can use those letters with the umlauts without any pause or hesitation, or even recognition that they're doing anything wrong. In panel B, you see an alternate type of approach. And instead of having letters, what it primarily has are instructions related to painting. So for example, the B and the GR, these reflect blau and grün, which happen to have the same starting letters as they do in English. The G down there is for gelb, which means yellow, as you might have guessed, because it's overlaid on yellow. And you have other commands. For example, the arrow commands can allow you to position something on a monitor that you want to paint. They're shapes, so you can choose to present circles or squares. You can choose the shading and other kinds of details. So all the other components about a visual P300 BCI are the same. You still have flashes, you're still looking for the same brain activity, but you have a different display, and the purpose is to create paintings. So here's an example of, I have a few examples of this brain painting BCI. This original paper was from Jana Munzinger and colleagues, and there's a picture of Andrea Kübler and a couple of her former students. And as it says here, all the brain painting images are from this website. So if you want, you can go there and see others. And so first, you see on the left, the very first example of a brain painting by this particular artist. And you see that it just has squares and relatively straightforward shapes. And on the right, you see a later painting by a different artist, which is a painting of a blackbird. And it's pretty good. And remember, this is not someone who can freely paint. So these are patients who are locked in. Typically, they have late-stage ALS, late-stage Lou Gehrig's disease. So they're limited to circles and a few other basic shapes with different shading. And so as you can imagine, painting something like either of these, but especially the blackbird picture, takes a lot of time. I mean, you have to search and select for each individual item that you want to put on the screen. And so this reflects really a lot of attention and effort and commitment by some of these people. And I have a short digression too, which is a nice story. So Dr. Kübler told me that one of her patients was in fact a former professional artist. So before she became locked in, she was a painter, and therefore restoring the ability to paint to her was very meaningful, even more so than for many other people, because she was used to that. That was her profession. That's how she expressed herself. And she said that she cried when she saw her first painting because she felt that she was empowered again, and that friends of hers recognized her style. They said, yeah, we see that she's able to paint again. We know her painting style. We knew this was her. And so spelling and other functions can, of course, have a big impact on people, but don't lose sight of creative applications. For some people, the ability to paint or make music or create in other ways is also very meaningful. This is another painter named Jürgen Thiele, and you see he has a different style. He was making a painting called Yellow Black with colorful dots, and I like it. I think it's cool. And so next, I'll talk about theoretical issues and new directions, or at least emerging directions. And again, I'm following the structure of my papers. So if you want more information about any of these, please just see the paper that I published last year. So one that's not so new or theoretical, but is, I put new in question marks because I'd like to see more of these. In 2011, this guy named Peter Brunner published a paper with an implanted P300 BCI, and this is the first such example. One of the authors, the co-authors of the paper, was an Austrian with an even worse name, which is Gerwin Schalt. And you see that in this paper, they had electrodes on the surface of the brain. So normally at this point in the talk, I have to pause and explain why people would put electrodes on the surface of the brain, but I don't have to because I know which group I'm talking to here. So we'll skip over that. So I think this person was epilepsy surgery. I'm not quite sure, but that's, anyway, you can ask her later. What you see in the top right is the relationship between the number of electrodes and two dependent variables, accuracy and bit rate in terms of bits per minute. And these are remarkable results for P300 BCI. In particular, if you have only one flash sequence, that is with single trials, you notice that with 6 electrodes or even using 2 or 3 electrodes, you get very good accuracy and bit rate, more than you would typically see in a non-invasive P300 BCI. And this is probably not surprising to people who know the implanted BCI literature, which in general you know much better than I do, which is that, sure, if you have an electrode right on the surface of the brain, you can get a much better signal than you can from something placed outside the head with the cap on the head. And there haven't been many more of these. There have been, of course, a lot of papers involving ECOG and other implanted approaches that have been very interesting and effective, but there hasn't been a lot with communication with P300 or other types of visual evoked potentials. And so perhaps we'll see more of these, especially since research and clinical applications involving ECOG are continuing to increase. And yeah, you see I kept adjusting my left AirPod because I knew it was going to fall out sometime. So one theoretical issue to mention, and this is again something that goes well beyond just P300 BCIs, is that there's not enough interdisciplinary collaboration. You notice that this is something that was even in that first major review paper I mentioned, Walpaw et al. 2002. There was also an even earlier review, Kübler et al. 2001. And to some extent, this problem has been reduced. That is, you see a lot more papers now where you have people who are collaborating across these different domains, but still you need more of them. And of course, what's going on in your lab represents an excellent interdisciplinary collaboration. And I think this is one of the reasons why you see that Kai and Gerv have been successful in their careers, and you see this with others. That is, most of the time, if you look at people who have had a high impact career in literature and helping patients, they usually have some very good interdisciplinary collaboration. Another theoretical issue is that bit rate is often misinterpreted. So watch out for that in papers. You see a lot of papers where they claim a very high bit rate, but it's kind of there's a sneaky trick in there somewhere. And of late, you may have heard that Facebook has stated that they will have a 100 word per minute BCI, and they don't have it yet, or if they have it, they haven't released it publicly, nor have they told me. Just a few hours ago, I talked to one of our mutual friends named Dr. Emily Mugler, who is with Facebook, and I was hoping she would tell me something new. She works with the BCI group in Section 8, but at the moment, they have nothing else publicly available. And of course, I would love to see 100 word per minute BCI, but keep an eye out. When they say 100 words per minute, are they accounting for things like error correction? Is it 100 words per minute from a palette of the entire English vocabulary or another language, or is it 100 words per minute out of a palette that's much smaller? Is it something that would work for anybody, or is it only 100 words per minute for one elite user? And again, I don't have any information about what they're doing or others are doing, but I'm just saying in general, you should keep an eye out for claims with a very, very high bit rate. They might not be practical in some way or another. Another very interesting issue, especially since I'm from cognitive science, is looking at BCI communication as a type of language. And I won't go into this too much because it's probably a talk in itself, but right now I'm speaking and I'm using a certain language. There are certain words that you can understand. You may hear that there is banda music in the background, which I cannot stop. And the lyrics for that is in Mexican. By the way, this is not a background sound on my part. There are bands roaming the beach and cannot be stopped. But the point is that if you speak English versus Spanish versus another language, you will be understood differently or misunderstood. And the signal processing is tuned accordingly. And similarly, there are different kinds of BCIs. There are P300 BCIs and motor imagery BCIs. And if you're using a P300 BCI and you imagine moving your left hand or imagine moving your right hand, you're not going to be understood very well. Similarly, if you're using a motor imagery BCI and you're watching a bunch of flashes to produce P300s, that will not be an effective way to communicate. And there are lots of other issues with BCIs as language, but I won't get into them so much now. And this one I'll also just present briefly, but this was something from a book chapter I wrote in 2009 where I was trying to look at all of the issues. The basic point of this slide is to think about BCIs broadly. So many people have looked at BCIs only in terms of factors like information throughput, which is certainly very important, but even information throughput itself can be broken down. There's accuracy, the number of signals you can choose from, and the number of signals you can send per minute. All three of those influence information throughput. And going beyond that, you have a lot of other factors. For example, reliability is a really big deal for some applications, especially independent patient use. Some patients have said that they would prefer a system that is more accurate, even if it's ultimately slower, just because they find mistakes very frustrating. Also, there have been some very nice studies that have actually surveyed patients and their families. And so this is an obvious thing to do when you're working with patients, but it's a lot harder with BCIs. You have to go to the patients and say, hey, what are you trying to do? What is your goal here? What do you want to communicate? What are the most important factors to you in your system? And many of the results have indicated that cosmesis is very important, which just means appearance. What does it look like? So for example, one patient said, you want me to wear a cap, but I'm trying to get rid of this breathing tube. And another patient once, one of the first things she communicated is, why do I wear such an ugly hat? And so the point being that things that we might think of as very important for ourselves as healthy end users are not necessarily the same as patient end users or even other types of end users. Another issue I like to bring up is called situational disability. And this is a term that I learned from the human-computer interaction literature. And this refers to when a healthy person can't use a natural means of communication and control in a certain situation. So even if you're an able-bodied person, if you're driving, well, in a sense, you're not able to use your hands. You probably could not type. You should not use a cell phone. In general, if you're driving, your hands should be limited to working with the steering wheel. If you are a mechanic, you're working on a jet engine. Of course, military examples, if you're a soldier, you have to hold a weapon. There are a lot of cases in everyday life where people just simply aren't able to use their hands. And so these may be people who are more interested in a BCI, at least at those times, because they need some form of backup, some way to communicate using something that is hands-free. And this can occur with laziness as well. So a common example is the remote control. So the remote control for the television or for another video player is a great device. And it may seem like it's a nice assistive technology for people who are physically unable to get up and walk across the room to change the channel. But in most cases, that's not why they're used. The reason that you don't get up to change the channel is not that you're disabled, but simply that you don't feel like it. You're too lazy. And so you pick up a remote control and you're able to remain in your seat and change the channel. But consider the burden that that places on you. You have to dig around through the couch. You have to actually find the remote control. You have to grab it. You have to bring it up to you. You have to orient it correctly, point it at the TV. You have to actually find the button that you want to push and push it. This is a horrible imposition on your TV viewing experience. And I mean, it can ruin the entire show or the entire binge watch session. And so if you could have an even easier way to do that, such as a BCI, and you could have a BCI to do that, I'm just not sure it would be easier right now, then you would have a device that, kind of like other devices, it seems like it might be meant to help a disabled person, but it's actually appealing to a much broader audience. So to talk about a few relatively new studies, so there has been some work with trying to use P300 BCIs for the purpose of improving attention. And so the short version of what this graph shows, and this is not my work, this is a paper that came out a couple of years ago, is that in theory, you can train people to have larger P300s by using a P300 BCI. Basically, you're rewarding them over and over and over again if they can produce a larger difference between targets and non-targets. So theoretically, if you did that, you would be training the attentional system. That is, people might be better at detecting targets amidst noise. And of course, there might be side effects that should be considered, but I wanted to mention this because it's one of the pretty rare examples of BCIs that are in the so-called improved category, where you're trying to improve function. So I now have several slides talking about coma and disorders of consciousness. So to be clear, these are not separate things. So medically, the term disorder of consciousness refers to a range of conditions which include coma, and also, I think I mentioned earlier, they can include unresponsive wakeful state. This used to be called vegetative state, but that term is no longer used because it's offensive, and understandably so, and minimally conscious state. So before you got here, Kai, and before the talk officially started, I was presenting a little bit of the work. Damien Coyle has some new work with motor imagery for DOT, which is pretty interesting.
Oh, cool.
And he gave a talk yesterday, by the way, for UCSD, for Gert Kalvenberg's lab. And I was glad he did. It's a good talk. The reason I use this image here is we published a paper in Frontiers for Young Minds. So this is a version of Frontiers that is targeted toward younger readers. And I was pretty happy to be able to contribute to this. I thought it was fun to be able to write something that might get younger readers in the field. And we actually got reviewed by, one of the reviewers was 12 years old, and the reviewer comments from him were just warmed my heart. I mean, he obviously got it, and he said, oh, you know, I realize now you can read things from the brain and you can use that to help people. That's really cool. But yeah, that's why I wrote the paper. If that's what one reviewer thinks, I mean, thousands of people might read this and get into the field. So what this shows is the approach that we used. People had a cap on the head, but since these patients typically cannot see, we put a vibrating tactor on the wrist. So this is just a band that would vibrate. And if you put one on the left wrist and one on the right wrist, you can create a selective attention task. So they don't vibrate continually, they just vibrate in little pulses. And it feels a little bit like one of those buzzers that's a practical joke when you shake someone's hand and it buzzes you and you go, ah, you got me. Boy, that's original. That's the sort of thing Gerb would do. And you can tell people to count events on either their left wrist or their right wrist, and thereby you can elicit P300s to only the left or right events. And the reason to do this in this case is not primarily as a communication system, but as an assessment tool. So people who have a disorder of consciousness are often not only unable to communicate, but they may have serious cognitive deficits. And by the way, obviously, Kai Miller is much more qualified on these medical details than I am. And this paper here is a good example of this collaboration with medicine. So Dr. Spatato and Dr. Labella on the author list are both neurologists. So unlike me, they're trained as medical doctors. They're able to work directly with patients. But they've said what I've heard from other people as well, which is that it's often difficult to know if that patient is really there, or the extent to which that patient retains cognitive control, the ability to understand what's going on, to understand language, to make decisions. And so the idea here is that if they are able to use a P300 BCI, then that implies quite a lot of things. So if you can do all the tasks I described with that, well, then you can understand language, you can maintain attention, you have adequate memory to do it, you can choose to attend to the left side or the right side, you can do this over a period of several minutes. There are a lot of things that it tells you about that patient's remaining capabilities that you might not be able to detect any other way. So most people with Lou Gehrig's disease, certainly not all, but most of them are considered aware. There's not so much of a need to test their awareness. But in the case of persons with a disorder of consciousness, there may be great uncertainty about their remaining awareness, their remaining capabilities. And this can in turn have a huge bearing on the type of care that the neurologist will choose. It may even affect end-of-life issues. So particularly in Europe, there are many cases where someone may make the decision on behalf of the patient to terminate life support, and they may not be aware that the patient is able to communicate, is able to convey what he or she wants. And of course, the patient may choose either way. On the other hand, if the patient says that he or she would like to terminate life support, then that creates other considerations as well. And this is one of the co-authors I mentioned, Dr. Spatato. This is Dr. Rupert Ortner. So one of the other things that we really needed was engineering. I'd said before, you need many facets of engineering, and indeed you need to consider electrical engineering. This is the first author's background, Christoph Guger. And you also need programming. This is what Rupert Ortner does. And depending on the device, you may also need things like hardware engineering or biomedical engineering. That's what Gerv does. He's biomedical engineering. You may need robotics engineering. So when we have the paper with the mobile robot, well, you need someone who can work with mobile robots and so on. This is the system that we used. It's called the Mind Beagle system. And you see that it has some straightforward looking electrode caps and an amplifier. The monitor shows the free running EEG on the top right. And next to that is an indicator of the electrode signal quality. So in this example, they're all green, which shows that the electrodes have a good connection. The bottom of the screen shows something that's probably familiar to you by now, which is a P300. So the big bump there is a P300, and you see there's another line that doesn't have a big bump. That's the non-target line. And on the left side are just icons to launch different things, like you can launch auditory or vibrotactile types of approaches. This is a newer result. We just came out with this, I think 2018. So our first work with this was 2017. And we were looking at outcome prediction. That is, based on the results of a P300 assessment, can you determine whether someone will change later on? And so you notice that there were 13 patients in this study. They're all UWS, or unresponsive wakeful state. And notice that there are 3 patients, specifically 1, 7, and 9, where the accuracy is at least equal to a threshold we made, which was 50%, across 2 different tests. And chance accuracy in this particular test was equal to 50%, or 12.5%. And so this was across 30 trials. It was substantially above chance accuracy. And notice that those 3 patients, 6 months later, their condition improved. So patient 1 the condition improved to MCS, or minimally conscious state. And there's a score called the CRSR, or the Coma Recovery Scale Revised. 15 is a good score for these types of patients. Similarly, patient 7 also improved to MCS, and patient 9 improved the most. Patient 9 actually woke up from the coma, so this is emerged from minimally conscious, whereas the remaining patients were not as healthy several months later. So the point of this paper is that the results of a P300 test can in fact provide some indication of where you're going to be 6 months later. And this can also help with issues like family considerations. So what's the likelihood that our loved one will remain in a coma or in a different type of disorder of consciousness 6 months later? And of course, we're working on follow-ups where we can look at this many years later. And this is, again, a first time we produced this kind of result. So we're not saying that this should enter widespread clinical practice just yet, but we think that EEG-based measures could be a nice supplement to other clinical scales that are used to assess these types of patients. So the next slides will be relatively quick. I'm just presenting a series of examples of other applications that have been explored, and I think you'll see more of. So you're probably aware that there's been a lot of work on neurofeedback, and P300 BCIs have been involved there. The problem with neurofeedback is pretty frustrating in that for some patients and some applications, if done properly, neurofeedback can be helpful. A lot of people have said that it can help to reduce stress. Many people are exploring it for autism or ADHD or other conditions, but there have been a lot of false claims, a lot of what might be called baloney BCIs. I usually use another word starting with B, but I'm aware that Kai Miller's kids are around. And so baloney BCIs involve basically dishonest claims about what a system might do. And so these are unfortunately very prominent. I'm sad to say, I think you'll see more of these in the future as BCIs become more prominent. People say, hey, I can make a lot of money by promising to have a BCI that'll do something, even though it does not actually do so. And this is part of why I mentioned this concern up here in the bottom, which is how do you identify the best neurofeedback systems? For people like us, it might be easier, but if you're an end user, you don't have any scientific or medical training, it's hard. A lot of these websites look very professional. They have testimonials from doctors. They mention papers. It's hard. And so obviously, if you're thinking about neurofeedback, you should talk to an appropriate professional. But I think you're going to see an increase in systems being sold for home use that are, at least in some cases, not effective. And this is, I just included this again because it's an example of improving attention where, as the authors say in their paper, they're honest about it, this is not yet meant for prime time, but perhaps it will be. And maybe in several years, there will be systems you can use to improve your attentional skill through P300 neurofeedback. This is another early approach with lie detection. This is the other guy from Farwell and Donchin. So this man here is Dr. Larry Farwell. He was a graduate student of Manny Donchin. And what the P300 can detect is whether an image is familiar to you. So that's why I put the word lie in quotes. It's not really detecting whether or not you're lying. What it's detecting is whether the accused has some kind of guilty knowledge. That is, if you claim that you didn't rob a bank, then you shouldn't be familiar with certain images like the inside of the bank, assuming you've never been to the bank for innocent reasons like just banking. And so that was the approach that Larry Farwell and his colleagues promoted. And Dr. Farwell has had a company for many years now called brainwavescience.com, where he tries to sell these for forensic purposes. So that is, he's trying to help courts and police and other people identify who is guilty and who is innocent. And of course, this could have some implications that people aren't comfortable with, But on the other hand, if you can get people off death row, for example, who really are innocent, well, that's a very noble goal. Many people have worked on task adaptation. So NASA had a lot of work on this through a guy named Alan Pope. And Alan Pope has retired, but his colleague named Chad Stevens took over. And so the idea here is that you can adapt a system based on EEG measures of task engagement, which the P300 can reflect along with other signals. So if someone is overloaded, you will see a reduction in the P300 because they're not able to pay attention to stimuli too much. And so you might ask someone to come up and help, or you might switch some tasks to an automatic system, or otherwise unburden the operator to reduce the chance of error. You can do similar things with game adaptation. So this is one paper where they were working on adapting the game Tetris so that it becomes more or less difficult based on EEG activity. Paul Scheida and colleagues had this quite a while ago, where you can show images very quickly and you can try to identify which images are of interest to the end user. So this could be good for photo analysis. The aforementioned guy named Christoph Güger refers to this as the Blondie check. So the idea here is that you present images and you see which one the person likes because she's a blondie. Of course, I would find that offensive. Most of us would. Kai Miller, well, he has lighter hair, but hey. Music. So at the 4th International BCI meeting, a group from UC San Diego, which, as I mentioned, I like, played music. So the guy in the middle there is named Tim Mullen, and he was using his electrode cap to present music. And the person sort of behind him wearing blue is a guy named Scott McCaig. He's one of the giants of the field. He's really got a lot of good papers. And this is a little bit like the brain painting I showed. It's a creative application, but obviously for music instead of visual art. Neuromarketing, there's been a lot of this. So can you use the P300 to detect how people respond to sounds or images? Certainly. The reason I put this arrow with the line with the slash is that obviously it's not literally looking to see if you have these words or logos in your brain, but it can certainly indirectly interpret how you feel about these certain things. One example was with Harley Davidson perfume. So this was a type of perfume that didn't go very well, probably because most guys do not want to smell like a big sweaty biker. Error detection. So this is a paper from Schalk et al. 2000. So this guy is kind of a loser. Oh no, sorry, that's Gerwin Schalk right there. So that's a paper from Gerwin Schalk, and I won't present this in more detail. I do want to note, by the way, I didn't just put this image in there for this talk. This is Kai Miller receiving one of the BCI awards from a conference in California. And the speaker there is Gerwin Schalk. Behind him, that's me, and then Kai Miller is kind of blocking him, but that's Christoph Güger in the background. And you can use a signal called the ERN, or error-related negativity, to identify if people think they just made a mistake. So you could use that to correct errors. The P300 can also index errors. Alertness monitoring, there's also been a lot of work on this. This is more of a passive BCI approach where you're trying to not interrupt the user. The user doesn't actually have to do anything unique to the BCI. You just look at activity. And so that's Torsten Zander, the person not wearing the cap in the bottom left. Torsten Zander is a good guy. He's done a lot of work. He's now working in Berlin. If you guys go to BCI conferences, he's at quite a lot of them. The next slide is, the top is Xiping Zheng, and the latter is Terry Sanowski. This is with sonar operators. So they had a 2-channel system with sonar operators. Another example is driver engagement. So driver engagement was a Google approach to try to see if drivers are dozing off. And nearing the end of this section, which is pretty close to the end of my talk overall, I just had this quote for critical thinking. And this is a picture of someone named Alan Gevins on the bottom left. He's also a giant of the field. And he's essentially asking, how much extra information are you getting from a brain monitoring system? So if you're trying to assess workload, are you really learning that much more with an electrode CAT system than you would from photodiodes or a software agent that counts mouse clicks and microphones? You know, you can, but he's just saying that you have to think critically about these things. And finally, cockroach racing. So I'm proud to say this was not a P300 BCI, but this is true. You can go to this website right now and buy a system for a cockroach. This was a book chapter that I edited, and it's actually a combination of a BCI and a CBI, or a computer to brain interface. So people used electrode caps to control a BCI that sent signals to cockroaches. Then this device sent signals to cockroaches' brains to direct them around a maze. So it was, in fact, cockroach racing. And I edited the book to make sure that in the acknowledgments, they acknowledged the cockroaches. I think I said something like, we want to thank all participants, both human and animal. For the first time in my life, I actually felt bad for the cockroaches. Like, they have lives, they don't necessarily want to go into your race. So for closing comments, ethical issues include, of course, replication and reliability, privacy, identity, agency, false hope. Part of why I'm going over some of these quickly is, again, you're in Kai Miller's lab. He's widely known as a very ethical guy, and unlike many of us, is trained in medical issues with patients because of his medical background. But I want to pause on media misrepresentation. So this is unfortunately a big concern. There are a lot of articles out there that are misleading. They give the impression. So yeah, by the way, I'm aiming for about an hour, so I'm done pretty soon, fortunately. And they may present BCIs as overly negative or overly powerful. And John Walpaugh has railed about this a lot. When Gerv Schalk and John Walpaugh had one paper, there was an article that said, we don't need no thought control, referring to Gerwin Schalk's ability to decode people thinking about Pink Floyd. And that's the key point about BCIs. You use the thoughts to control other things. They're not devices that allow you, that are made to control other people, which is much more insidious. Bi-Fi is just my term for brain-computer interface science fiction. If you think of examples of this in science fiction, they're almost universally negative, and BCIs are greatly overpowered relative to what they can do. So a BCI reads from the brain, not writes to it. Writing to a brain is a CBI. Certification and enforcement. This is my issue with baloney BCIs. Yes, these are baloney BCIs. See, the word at the top is baloney. We don't want those. And for emerging issues, I'll skip over a lot of these because the talk is recorded and because you know already. And I wanted to end with some kind of fun slides of BCI hackathons. So there are lots of these, and I'd certainly encourage you guys to have one. Both Gerv and Kai know how they can be set up. I'd be happy to help as a juror or something. But these basically mean that you get a bunch of BCIs and everybody forms little groups and they work together on a BCI, on a new BCI project for maybe 24 hours. So here are some pictures from them. These are different BCI hackathons that have occurred at different places around the world, different labs and groups. And you can even have them for kids. So these are a couple pictures. The left image shows a kid who designed a new type of BCI cap. So this is the frog BCI cap. You might say, hey, that kid looks a little bit young to be able to make his own BCI. Well, his dad is the one who did the electronics, but he did come up with the idea for the system. And the middle image, or the right image, shows other kids from a hackathon. And you see one example is a BCI with beads, which is pretty cool. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of that. Gerv probably would not have thought of that, thought, hey, let's put beads on there. And so they can be fun events. They get kids to like BCIs. Maybe some of them will go into science or medicine. We don't know. Also, cybathlons are really good events. These are where real patients compete using BCIs to play certain BCI games. So this is an example from Graz in Austria in 2019 at the 8th International BCI Conference. Graz is very close to Fürstenfeld, which Gerwin Schalk can tell you a lot about. It also happens to be very close to Thal, which is Arnold Schwarzenegger's hometown. So just for reference, by the way, people in Austria generally do not speak like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't know where he got that accent. There's only one Austrian who I ever saw speaking like that. It was at Josef Fahler's PhD defense, and it was about medical imaging. And so I asked the professor, do you have any thoughts about a medical imaging system that you could use to address the question of whether something is a tumor or is not a tumor? And I was trying to get it to say it's not a tumor, but he did not respond as desired, and I was really disappointed. This is another example of a BCI cybathlon race. Here's another one at Zurich. And in China, they've had this world robot contest where people compete to use a BCI system to control robots. That's pretty cool. There's a lot of good BCI work in China. And finally, I would like to thank Kai Miller for inviting me to speak. And thank you all for listening. And I'm happy to take questions now and via email. Thank you.
Great talk, Brendan.
Thank you.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Oh, did I cut someone off?
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, sorry, Harvey.
Did you have a chance to introduce yourself, Michael, and explain what your interest in these things are?
I don't think I didn't. My name is Michael. I'm an MD PhD student here, and I'm planning to do my PhD starting this summer with Kai in his lab. And I'm planning to do it largely, a large portion of it based around BCI. So I'm very interested in this, but I am just starting to learn about this as well. So one question just to clarify on the spelling matrix and the brain painting matrix. So does each symbol in that matrix represent its own P300?
Yes, each symbol in the matrix
or corresponds.
Is a potential command. And one of the main things they've been working on is new palettes of commands so that the painters have more flexibility. So I know that they came out with a paper after their first paper. I think it was called Brain Painting 2, and they had more painting commands. But I think I'd be happy to provide a warm introduction to Professor Kübler in Germany, and she could probably tell you a lot more about it. In particular, if you might be interested in working with that approach with any patients there or with ECOG, to my knowledge, there's no work on that. No one has done brain painting with ECOG or anything like that. And I'd be curious what they come up with.
Okay. Another question I had was kind of based on that is the EEG placement, the electrode placement. Is that pretty important when you're dealing with? Not really.
No, Gerb is right. It used to be considered important. So like when I was in grad school, we had to measure the head and place electrodes according to this thing called the 10 to 20 system. But it turns out to be a lot less important than people had thought. There's a great paper, two papers you should read that were led by Dean Kruzienski, 2007 and 2008. And these papers looked at a lot of little details of how to optimize performance with P300 BCIs from a signal processing perspective. And one of them is he looked at which montages and which sites were most important. Like prior to that, a lot of people had been using electrodes over different areas than people use today. And so he explored that. He's like, well, what if we just look at these sites down the midline or a few sites around the back? And he found things like, for example, the frontal areas weren't really important. If you don't even have electrodes there, wouldn't matter. I think another implication of this is if you want to get away from caps, like for mainstream consumer use, you could just have a headband with some electrodes over occipital sites, and it would work pretty well.
Okay, I looked at them. I'll look at those. My last question is, can these P300s I'm trying to think of a scenario in this in which this would be true, where it changes over time. So your attention with respect to a certain symbol or that signal that you're getting from that changes over time based on, I don't know, training if you're training something else with a similar symbol and you have a certain P300 associated with that, and they both kind of merge or diverge. And does that ever happen? Or if someone sees a P, they're going to have the exact same P300 associated with that P for the rest of their.
Well, sorry, I misunderstood what you were saying at first. The P300 changes over time, meaning that as you go to different points in the signal, the shape of the waveform changes. But if you use a P300 BCI pretty extensively, you don't really see dramatic changes in the waveform. So I did mention that you can use the P300 BCI to train people to have a larger P3, but that was with a paradigm specifically designed for it. To answer in a little more detail, there used to be this presumption that the more you elicited P300s, the more you habituated. That is, the P300 became smaller and smaller over time. And this would seem to be really bad for long-term P300 BCI use. But as people actually started looking at long-term use, they found this wasn't the case, probably because you are providing some reward. You're trying to maintain the same signal over long time periods. For work on that, there's a paper led by Yalda Shahriari, and it's maybe easier to find if you look for her advisor, Dean Kruzienski. He was the senior author. I was also an author on the paper along with Teresa Vaughn, where she was looking at changes in the P300 over long-term home use. And the P300 was pretty stable. Another thing that I didn't get into much in this talk, but there are other components of that waveform that are useful, not just the P300. So I mentioned the N4 is good for faces. There's another part that's earlier called the N2 that also differentiates attention versus non-attention or ignoring something. With respect to ECOG, there's a whole wide open field there. Like I would suspect, for example, more time and power examples would be much more interesting. And so Scott McCaig has this idea that the P300 is doing a lot of phase resetting. Gerwin Shaw has his own perspective, which I think is very interesting, and I want to see more about it, about what's actually causing these deflections in the EEG and the ECOG. I mean, why is that really occurring? Is it a result of biased oscillations, as he's arguing? And it would be interesting to see that. That is, I think if you're using signals with ECOG, the P300 wouldn't be the most ecumenical way to interpret what's happening. I mean, you would see positive deflections around 300 milliseconds, but you would see much more detail, and I think there'd be a lot more interesting activity that could be used. You might get much higher speed communication. Also, what I would suggest if you're playing with that would be to try to look at M sequences or code-based VEP. And I know at least Gerv knows a lot about that, where it's a variant of steady state visual evoked potentials, where you have these things called M sequences in each of the cells of the matrix. And it's the same M sequence every time, but it's offset by maybe 50 milliseconds or a certain amount. And each M sequence is just a specific pattern of stimulation that, unlike SSVEP, is aperiodic. So that is, I got it just as it fell out. So you have, for example, with SSVEP, you might have exactly 10 oscillations a second. Every 100 milliseconds, an oscillation starts. With M sequences or code-based VEP, you would instead have a certain irregular pattern. And what you're looking for is the correlation matrix with that pattern for each of the cells. So you're basically saying, okay, based on the timing of us seeing this pattern in the person's EEG, the person must be looking at, the 23rd cell in the matrix, or, row 4, column 5, something like that. And I suspect, although I'm not sure, that you'd get more detailed, much richer results with ECOG. But again, both, by the way, Kai has a PhD in physics, but both Gerv and Kai would be more qualified on that than I would.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Allison. Great presentation. I have just kind of two questions. The first one is, I think you alluded to a little bit about how these different methods can yield different amounts of temporal resolution or bit rate. I'm wondering, with the P300 method, I'm envisioning that there is a ceiling bit rate just by the fact that the P300 itself looks like it's about 200 milliseconds, and there's probably some refractory period. So is there any way to get around this and perhaps get past the ceiling of temporal resolution?
Yes, I mean, yes and no. So you're right in that the P300 has a certain limitation in terms of the delay after each flash. And there are just practical limitations on how many stimuli you can present per second. You can try tricks like training people or choosing people with really good attentional systems, but still that particular fundamental limitation, I can't think of any way to get around that with P300s, or even more fundamentally with any type of sensory-based stimulus. I mean, no matter what, you can only present so many tactile or auditory or visual or whatever modality stimuli to people per second or per minute, and there's inevitably a certain delay before attention starts to kick in. I mean, the auditory brainstem response, to choose a really easy example, you're not gonna, you can't modulate that with selective attention like you can with, say, a P300. But there are other ways to get around it. So one way is, of course, to increase the set size. So instead of having a 6x6 matrix, you have much larger matrices. And this was something I explored in my PhD thesis. It's published in my work with Jamie Pineda, where we looked at changing set size, where we went up to 12 by 12. And so now, instead of having individual letters, we had pairs of letters. And there's no reason why that's a limitation. So you could have hundreds or even thousands of stimuli from which to choose. And I'd say, obviously, when you're getting into thousands or even several hundred, it would require some training to use. But, you know, what if you had, for example, letters, words, icons, common phrases, pictures? With some training, if the person knows where to look, if you have a very large monitor, you know, or something immersive like a VR headset, even though you're only getting a certain number of signals per minute, your vocabulary size has increased dramatically. Another big component, which Teresa Vaughn did a lot with the Toby communicator, is word completion, you know, and even sentence completion. So the approach that she uses, once you spell one letter or more letters, it tries to complete the word for you. This is nothing new. This is like T9 with cell phones, but that's another sort of trick for improving bandwidth. Another one is the use of menus. There really hasn't been a lot of that, but what if the first screen allows you to select one of 64 menus, and then you can have letters and words and a wide range of things? Well, if each of them corresponds to a second menu, then your first menu gives you 64 things, but the next level would give you 64 times 64 choices, disregarding things like backspace and whatever. So then it's another way to greatly increase your vocabulary.
To expand on this, Harvey, you can actually overlay, you don't have to wait until the P300 is fully, whatever, developed or something. You don't have to wait. If it goes from 300 to 400 milliseconds or something, you don't have to wait for the 300 or 400 milliseconds until it's over. You can sort of stagger stimuli, and the brain, I mean, it's actually pretty crazy to think about this, but in the paper, the 2000, whatever it was, 11 paper that Brandon mentioned with the ECOG-based P300, we actually presented stimuli at a rate of 16 hertz. So 16 stimuli per second, which means a latency of like 60 milliseconds per stimulus, right? So you can present them, and then the P300 will come at some point later, you know, and then of course you have to sort of figure out with signal processing which stimulus it's from or whatever. So you have to do that properly. But at least from as far as the brain is concerned, you can do that. But as Brandon mentioned, you can only pay attention to so many things that quickly, right? I mean, you cannot pay attention to this thing over here and then this and then this and this and be perfectly accurate. There's a certain limitation, of course, in visual spatial attention. And so that's really the sort of from a attentional sensory perspective. I mean, that's basically the limit of our visual spatial attention capacity, right? And that's a pretty fundamental. You're obviously not going to beat that somehow.
Well, but sorry, you're right. But another possible way around it is going beyond visual attention. So what if you have a P300 BCI hybridized with a motor imagery BCI, where instead of the P300 BCI is giving you one of two things. And the way that you identify whether it's the left or the right is that the entire time you're selecting that character, you're thinking about grasping with your left hand or thinking about grasping with your right hand. Now, and we had some work on a combined system with SSVEP and motor imagery with my colleague Clemens Brunner out in Austria. But to my knowledge, nobody has done that type of P300 BCI. Like there was one paper from a group in China, I think it was Li et al., but I'm not sure. Might have been 2016, but it's cited in that paper. And what they did is they used the P300 BCI to move in one dimension and motor imagery to move in another dimension. So in that case, you weren't really using it to increase speed. It was giving you a larger vocabulary, but it ultimately wasn't increasing the ITR that much. The idea of using it simultaneously, where your task is to count stimuli and then simultaneously think about the left hand or the right hand. Don't think anyone's done that. I'm pretty sure no one has gone beyond that with ECOG, where with ECOG, you could do that with attention to individual fingers, for example. But I mean, in general, it's hard for me to push anything regarding ECOG with P300 because there are just so many untapped opportunities there. And I mean, Kai and Gurv in particular are more able to brainstorm these things than I am.
Wow, okay, these are really great points and nuanced approaches. I just have one other quick translational question, and that's, I think that the applications to the disorders of consciousness is really cool. I think you said something about how they're using something along those lines for decision making in Europe. What exactly is that status right now, either in Europe or with the American FDA? Like how much of this is being clinically applied to determine how conscious these patients are? And if it's not available yet, what do you see for the near future? Like when can we expect to see this in clinical practice?
Well, there are very different answers with respect to Europe and the EU. And I should also mention Japan, where you have kind of a continuum. In Japan, they provide a great deal of power and flexibility to medical doctors and especially neurosurgeons. So in Japan, and by the way, again, Gurv and Kai know about this better than I do, but for example, there's a guy out there named Dr. Kiyosuke Kamada, and he's put ECOG systems in a lot of patients without the need for approval that you would require elsewhere, particularly in the US. So their view out there is if you're a neurosurgeon, you should be able to decide what kinds of devices and approaches to use. On the other extreme, like in the United States, say Anthony Rotaccio or Kai Miller, for that matter, US-based neurosurgeons have a lot more limitations on which devices they can use. And I don't mean that only as a criticism. I mean, of course, that also prevents a lot of chicanery and helps to protect patients. So one part of the answer is that in general, you see this continuum with sort of Japan being the most flexible and the US, it seems, being more limited. All right. Hi. Look. Cool. So anyway, you have that continuum.
What, Brandon?
As far as, oh, sorry, I was going to answer the DOC part. With respect to disorders of consciousness, the I know that it's been used clinically with a lot of people. The main doctor using them is named Stephen Loris. I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly in Belgian, but Laureys. I think he has an H index above 150. He's a remarkable publication machine. And I know that they've used it there with respect to clinical decision making. In the US, to my knowledge, it's only been used experimentally. The main person who has done that is a guy named Lee Hochberg at Harvard. I can send you his email, or Kai and Gerth both know him. So anyway, sorry, Kai.
No, I just didn't know what you said. You said you exclaimed something right before that.
Oh, I was saying that at least from what I've seen with ECOG, there seems to be a continuum of acceptance of new technologies for doctors, where in Japan, like Dr. Kamada has a lot of flexibility with being able to implant patients without necessarily getting device approvals and going through other procedures that would typically be necessary in the United States for people like you or Dr. Ritaccio. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's, we're trying to use the Cortec device here, but you know, Ritaccio is at Mayo. He's at Mayo, Florida.
No, I didn't know that. Last year he was in Albany. Cool.
Yeah, no, he's in Florida, so we interact with him. Yeah, I mean, we, I think the regulatory process here can be good, but it's also a little onerous.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. It's good and bad. I mean, it's nice to give doctors flexibility, but obviously there are risks with letting people use devices that haven't been approved yet.
Yeah, well, we have the odd situation that's going on now where you have like, and I always, you know, say this about Medtronic stuff because I really don't like them, their equipment. I mean, I guess I like some stuff they make, but not their DBS stuff is terrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, the American system basically forced you to keep using stuff that was terrible because the barrier to entry was so high for other systems and they had a patent. But still you have it where, you know, certain indications, because the way devices work in the US is you don't get a device approved, you actually get an indication approved.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want your exact same DBS system to be approved for epilepsy as you have for Parkinson's, that's a whole separate process. So a lot of stuff we do is technically off label. But hopefully the regulatory system will change in the US at some point to where you have a separate thing where you have platform approval and indication approval, particularly for devices. That would be important. I don't know if, did you meet Dr. Clausen, Brandon? He's a neurologist that is part of our team who I work very closely with. You should also.
No, not before this.
Yeah, I am a neurologist, so work a movement disorders neurologist. So work with deep brain stimulation primarily,
Mm-hmm.
and go to the OR with Kai. And so there we're obviously have our whole clinical program, but we're looking at signals from, instead of the surface, it's or just throughout the brain, like you might with SEEG. We're looking at very specific kind of locations over and over in many patients, typically in the thalamus, motor thalamus, and that'd be for tremor, patients with tremor, otherwise subthalamic nucleus or other areas in that circuit for patients with Parkinson's would be the two main indications.
I love all the babies watching me right now. This is the youngest mean age of any audience I can remember. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for coming. I mean, we'd love to have you and come up to Rochester at some point.
Yeah, let's talk more. It looks like travel is opening up, and I'd love to see you, and I'll hopefully come up with another talk.
Yeah, that would be great.